It's a pleasure to host you here at Osgoode for the third talk in the Osgoode Colloquium on Law, Religion, Social Thought. Delighted that you could come. If you're interested in being on the ongoing mailing list, just visit the Colloquium's website, and there's an e-subscription that you can fill out. But most importantly, I wanted to say a few words by way of introduction for our guest, Professor Mayanthi Fernando. Professor Fernando is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and she earned her bachelor's in arts from Harvard and then her master's and doctorate at the University of Chicago. As is the case for people that are accomplished as she is, her path is lined with accolades. She was a Fulbright scholar. She was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, a wonderful place for social science research. And she's currently visiting at Wesleyan, teaching at that institution. Mayanthi is an anthropologist of Islam, of Western Europe, of the public sphere in interesting ways. And her research examines the intersection of Islamic and secular Republican traditions, and importantly, the ethical practices, the political practices, the community practices that are generated out of those encounters. I actually first came across Professor Fernando's work just reading one of her articles, and I was so taken with the theoretical sophistication, the originality, and most importantly, this incredible sensitivity to the lived realities of Muslim women living in France that I thought she'd be a perfect participant in the colloquium. And we're very fortunate to have a really exciting voice in the study of religion, in the study of sociology of religion and anthropology of religion. Very fortunate to have her here today. Her talk is entitled Regulating Intimacy, Religion, Sex, and Secular Cunning. So please join me in welcoming Professor Mayanthi Fernando.
Thank you, Ben, for the lovely introduction and for inviting me to come and present here and participate. And thank you all for coming. Can all of you hear me okay? So this talk is based on an article that's going to appear in Signs, the journal Signs, in 2014, but it's the beginning of a larger project on this whole concept and question of regulating intimacy and the way in which the regulation of sex and the regulation of religion overlap and intersect. And so because this is very much a project in its incipient stages, I welcome any sort of feedback, both theoretical, empirical, those of you who are legal scholars, legal as well, just in terms of where I can go from here in some sense. So I want to begin with Foucault's famous dictum from The History of Sexuality, in which he says, "Since the end of the 16th century, the putting into discourse of sex, far from undergoing a process of restriction, on the contrary, has been subjected to a mechanism of increasing incitement. The will to knowledge has not come to a halt in the face of a taboo that must not be lifted, but has persisted in constituting a science of sexuality." Now, I'm going to come back to this over the course of the talk, but I just wanted you to keep in mind this whole point about incitement as I proceed. And the talk is, for those of you who are at the law school, it's really not very much about the law. I'm going to start with two legal cases, but it really is much more about the regulation of private and public within a secular polity, and the kind of inconsistent entwinement of public-private religion politics and sex politics. So let me begin with two cases in France to set the stage empirically for the rest of my argument. In May 2008, a French civil tribunal in Lille granted a marriage annulment, an annulation de mariage, to a petitioner called Monsieur C, on the grounds that his wife, known as Madame H, had lied about being a virgin before marriage. Monsieur C argued that he considered virginity an essential quality in his spouse, a position he had made clear. Article 180 of the French Civil Code allows for annulments based on errors about the essential quality of the marriage partner, and Madame H did not contest the decision. So the case, one of several hundred marriages annulled yearly in France, should have remained inconspicuous. But Monsieur C and Madame H were Muslims. By late May, the tribunal's decision had generated a firestorm of protest, with politicians on the left and the right demanding that the annulment be annulled in order to protect French secularism, laïcité, from the supposed misogyny and sexism of fundamentalist Islam. And every time I say fundamentalist Islam, you should read quotation marks around the term fundamentalist. Much to her dismay, Madame H's non-virginity became a political cause célèbre. Indeed, the future of French secularity seemingly hinged on her now very public sex life. Ignoring Madame H's stated desire for both an annulment and an end to media scrutiny, the Minister of Justice suspended the initial annulment and appealed the decision to the appeals court, which in November 2008 overturned the Lille Tribunal's decision. And that decision was appealed by the couple, but the annulation of the annulation was upheld, and so they were refused a marriage annulment. Now, a very seemingly different case had unfolded elsewhere in France a few years earlier when a vacation cottage owner named Fanny Truchelou demanded that Horia Demiati and her mother, who had rented rooms, remove their headscarves before entering any common areas. Demiati refused such an arrangement and sued Truchelou for racial and religious discrimination. In October 2007, a criminal court heard the case. During the trial, Demiati's lawyers asked her a series of questions about herself, to show, as Demiati put it, and I'm quoting Demiati here, to show that I wasn't the Muslim woman that everyone assumes, who's illiterate, who spends her days in the kitchen, and who takes care of her husband and children. For his part, Truchelou's lawyer, Maître Alexandre Varro, declared that Demiati was not refused lodging because she was Muslim, but because she wore a headscarf. The headscarf, proclaimed Varro, and I'm quoting him here, the headscarf is not simply a religious sign, it is worn to hide the fact that one is a woman. He then turned directly to Demiati and demanded, "And you, Madame Demiati, why do you wear this headscarf?" Though her lawyers told her not to answer, and though she felt like she didn't owe him any explanation, Demiati nevertheless felt compelled to respond. "I couldn't not respond," she told me later. "I really wanted to respond to the question. I wanted to explain. I told him simply that it was the result of a spiritual and personal path." Seemingly quite different, together, these two cases reveal, I want to argue, an important aspect of secular power. Both cases not only make Muslim women the object of intense public debate, but they also make public, to the consternation of the women involved, two domains normally considered private, even intimate, namely sexuality and religiosity. In the first case, Madame H's sex life becomes a public affair. In the second, Horia Demiati is asked to publicly discuss the inner workings of her religious life. Both cases then challenge the public-private distinction with regards to sex and religion that anchors secular liberal democracies. After all, secularism is routinely defined by its proponents as the separation of religion from public political life, with religion relegated to the private sphere. Public and political life is thereby protected from religion, while religion is likewise protected from state interference. Similarly, in secular liberal societies, sexuality is in principle a private affair, beyond the purview of state intrusion. In fact, secularity has come to be seen as the necessary guarantor of women's sexual freedom from the clutches of fundamentalist religion, Islam in particular. Yet these two cases demonstrate how the key to upholding secularity depends on violating the very public-private distinction that underpins secularism's organization of political and social life, both in the way in which immigrant Muslim sex and religion have become objects of intense public debate, despite the ostensibly private nature of sex and religion, and in the way in which the political and legal practices aimed at securing secularity compel Muslim women to reveal the innermost details of their sexual and spiritual lives in the public sphere. Thus, secular governmentality is undergirded, I contend, by two competing imperatives of privatization and surveillance, which produce another set of contradictory demands on the objects of regulation, namely to hide and to exhibit, to make private and to render public. And hence, ultimately, the cunning of secular power. Summoned to hide and to exhibit simultaneously their sex and religion, Muslim women become responsible for transgressing the boundary between public and private that secular rule both implements and constantly undermines. So now a few words about the structure of the talk. The first part will focus on the regulation of Islam as a religion, and the second on the regulation of immigrant Muslim sexuality. In the third part, I try to weave these two parallel threads together to think about the interrelated construction of proper religion and proper sex. Finally, in the fourth concluding part, I elaborate on what I just call the cunning of secular power. So let me turn to the first part on the regulation of religious life. Though laïcité and secularism more generally are conventionally defined as the separation of church and state, of religion and politics, a number of scholars have argued that secularism entails instead the administrative and legal intervention into and regulation of religious life. After all, as Talal Asad has written, in order to protect politics from religion and to determine religion's acceptable forms within the polity, the state must first identify religion. And to the extent that this work of identification becomes a matter for the law, the secular state assumes the theological function of defining religious signs, as well as the power of imposing that definition on its subjects. Drawing on Assad's work, Hussein Agrama similarly contends that the secular state constantly draws a line between the religious and the secular by promoting an abstract notion of religion. The state defines the spaces religion should inhabit, authorizes the sensibilities proper to it, and then works to discipline religious traditions into conformity with this abstract notion and those attendant sensibilities. In France, laïcité has long entailed the remaking of communal and ethical life, and with regards to Islam in particular, the state has, since the 19th century colonization of Algeria, radically restructured the Islamic tradition and refashioned Muslim sensibilities, including the definition of what it means to be Muslim, into forms consistent with secular norms. Rather than separating religion from politics, then, secular governmentality necessarily involves the intersection of the religious and the political, since it entails the regulation, transformation, and definition of religion, real religion, by political and legal authorities. This produces one of the imminent tensions of secular rule. The political, legal, and institutional discourses and practices that attempt to separate private religion from public politics necessitate the constant trespass of the boundary between religion and politics and public and private that secular governmentality ostensibly seeks to establish. Beyond this initial tension, however, lies a second one. Secularization of Islam in this instance requires the constant surveillance of the private spaces to which religion has been assigned in order to verify that Muslims are, in fact, being properly religious. These, then, are the contradictory imperatives of secular rule: to separate and to surveil, to make private and to regulate. Foucault's influential dictum about repression and as incitement, how the putting into discourse of sex, far from undergoing a process of restriction, on the contrary has been subjected to a mechanism of increasing incitement, this dictum applies, it turns out, to the regulation of religion as well. For, like sex, religion, far from undergoing a process of simple restriction by secular, legal, and political authority, has been subjected to a mechanism of increasing incitement. Indeed, beyond the state's various regulations that seek to make Islam into a real religion and to refashion Muslim sensibilities to accord with secular religiosity, what is remarkable is how much Islam is talked about in the French public sphere. If the hallmark of what has been called the Islamic revival remains the participation of ordinary practitioners untrained in classical Islamic theology and jurisprudence, the same can be said for contemporary laïcité. The media and halls of government have become sites for separating Islam from Islamism, real religion from politicized religion, religion from politics. Real religion takes place in the private sphere, either within the realm of individual belief or in designated religious spaces like the mosque. Public expressions or practices of Islam outside these spaces are, as a consequence, turned into forms of religious fundamentalism, hence my suspicion of the term, of an excess of religion that is in fact not real religion, but rather political. Thus, numerous government commissions declare that the headscarf is not a Quranic obligation and not one of the pillars of Islam, and as former Minister Françoise Ostelier put it, that the headscarf is, and I quote, "The headscarf is not a religious gesture, but a political gesture," and this is obviously a common refrain. Concomitantly, since the headscarf is not a real religious practice, anyone wearing it immediately becomes suspect. Maître Varro is not the only one asking, why do you wear this headscarf? The constant posing of that question and the scrutiny of the motivations, desires, and intentions of veiled women constitute an incitement to speak about one's religious life, to justify one's practices, and to reveal the inner workings of one's faith. And just as Horia Demiati felt compelled to respond to Varro's question despite her better judgment, so do many veiled women in France. Consider a 2003 article by Felwine Sarr in Umma.com, a generalist Franco-Islamic website. Sarr criticizes the fact that, and I'm quoting her here, criticizes the fact that, quote, Muslim women are questioned in an inquisitorial manner about the reasons for their choice to wear the headscarf, declaring, they don't have to justify themselves with regards to the validity of their reasoning. It is complex, belongs to them, and comes from an intimate casuistry, unquote. Having affirmed that she and other veiled women do not need to justify themselves, Sarr then spends the next 4 paragraphs doing just that, laying out in intimate detail the intimate casuistry, the relationship between self and body, and attendant notions of intimacy, upon which the practice of veiling rests. The ambivalent structure of Sarr's response echoes Demiati's reasoning in court. On the one hand, Demiati sees no reason to explain her personal spiritual undertaking. I don't owe Varro an explanation, she says. On the other hand, as she put it, she couldn't not respond. Indeed, against the advice of her lawyers, she wants to respond. I wanted to explain, she says, to give an account of herself, to show that she's a normal, modern French woman, not the victim of fundamentalists, nor alternatively a fundamentalist herself. Always already interpolated as religiously aberrant, she must prove otherwise. Like Sarr, Demiati cannot resist answering the question. Compulsion here operates on 2 registers, as both force and desire. For the external compulsion, or command, to account for oneself becomes a deontic compulsion, a need to respond. Now, like the incitement to discourse itself, this dual compulsion operates on the sexual lives of Muslims and immigrants as well. So let me turn now to the second part of the talk on the regulation of immigrant Muslim sexuality. In the past decade, France has passed ever more restrictive legislation, including the 2004 and 2010 veil bans, aimed at the twin goals of buttressing secularity and emancipating Muslim women from sexually repressive and patriarchal Islamic tradition. Moreover, the discourse of immigrant integration into secular French norms is increasingly mapped onto a distinction between aberrant and normal sex, with deviations from the sexual norm, polygamy, gang rape, forced marriage, domestic and sexual violence, all of these taken as signs of deviant Muslim cultural alterity and non-belonging to France. The sexual freedom and sexual equality supposedly guaranteed by laïcité thereby rest on a project of sexual regulation and normalization of France's immigrant origin population, a project that consistently oscillates between public and private realms, even as it attempts to instruct Muslims in secular norms of public-private. Marriage has become a major site of legal regulation, and references to dangerous deviations from proper republican marriage, that is, forced marriages and fraudulent marriages, saturate debates about immigration. In April 2006, for example, a domestic violence law increased the power of public officials to annul arranged or forced marriages. The law also enables officials to investigate suspicious marriages and annul fraudulent marriages, that is, marriages contracted not out of love, but for immigration reasons, i.e. what are called mariage blanc, which are explicit green card marriages, and mariage gris, which are extra fraudulent marriages in which a French spouse is duped by her lover. And of course, in this situation, the French spouse is always female, and the duping lover is always an Arab or African man. This 2006 law follows a 2005 Ministry of Justice letter of instruction to magistrates that details how to identify and investigate suspected cases of simulated marriages, either forced or fraudulent, and especially those concerning non-French nationals. A similar 2003 immigration law intended to combat marital fraud allows officials to interview prospective marriage partners separately if they become suspicious about the true intentions of one or both of the partners. Historian Judith Serkis has rightly noted that these laws aimed at regulating immigrant marriages are acts of national sovereignty, a sovereignty that is exercised by policing women's, and especially Muslim women's, sexual freedom in the name of protecting it. The regulation of migrant marriages and the state's attendant scrutiny of migrant intimacies parallel other measures deployed against immigrant and immigrant origin women to guarantee the republic's sex norms. In March 2003, for example, a new law on internal security criminalized passive soliciting for sex. Any woman whose dress or attitude gives the impression that she is soliciting money for sex now faces a fine and up to 2 months in prison. The law also mandates that a non-national arrested for passive soliciting can have her residence permit revoked, a clear indication of this new law's location in a larger project of immigration control. Importantly, as anthropologist Miriam Tickton contends, even the term passive soliciting is defined in such a way that the police have the power to determine what behaviors can constitute soliciting. Like Circus, Tickton reads these measures to protect public order and sexual freedom as exercises in state sovereignty. This exercise of sovereignty, whose goal is to normalize migrant sex and make it republican and secular, depends on penetrating into and surveilling the ostensibly private domain of the bedroom and of individual desire. Tal al-Assad has claimed that one aspect of secular sovereignty is precisely the state's power to determine what constitutes a religious sign and its meaning, and he argues that the state does not restrict itself to what is visible, but also confers upon itself the authority to decipher psychological processes like desire and will. Interestingly, Assad's observation about the domain of religion applies to that of sexuality as well. Both the marriage laws I just discussed and the 2003 law on passive soliciting call for public officials to determine the unstated intentions of the subject under their watch. Civil officials must determine whether the couple before them genuinely loves one another, the normative basis for companionate marriage, or whether the marriage is a fraud, i.e. not really about love, asking probing questions that reveal the nature of whatever intimacy exists between partners. What is your partner's favorite sexual position is a common question to determine whether they are in fact having sex, right? Similarly, which of course constitutes the basis of love and marriage. Similarly, police must determine whether a woman on the street intends to solicit sex, reading her behavior and dress as external signs of an interior intention. In both these instances, public officials must render external and public that which is ostensibly internal and private, and to do so in the name of upholding a normative sexuality subtended by a strong distinction between private and public, internal and external, intimate and political. Put another way, the reformation of immigrant subjects' sexual behavior so as to reproduce the particular arrangement of public-private on which secular republican sexuality depends requires the constant trespass of that boundary. Significantly, a number of self-declared secular Muslim women, musulmanes laïques, have become key players in the state's project to reform immigrant sexuality, most notably Fadela Amara and Lubna Melian, the co-founders of Ni Putes Ni Soumises, which I'll translate as neither whores nor doormats, a group protesting the denigration of immigrant origin women in the banlieue or outer city suburbs. Much of the success of Ni Putes Ni Soumises can be attributed to the way in which its leaders position themselves, offer themselves, and are eagerly read as liberated, integrated counterpoints to the paradigmatic menace of the veiled woman, la musulmane voilée. In this narrative, liberation and integration hinge on these secular Muslim women's active embrace of secular republican heterosexual norms. In her autobiography, for example, Amara identifies wearing makeup and certain forms of dress, and I quote her here, short skirts, tight-fitting jeans, low-cut blouses, and short t-shirts as necessary to showing off our femininity against the backdrop of repressive Muslim patriarchy. Similarly, Melian once remarked, and I quote Melian here, "It's better to wear a miniskirt and take up one's femininity than to hide it behind the veil in order to avoid the gaze of others," unquote. Melian and Amara thus identify certain sartorial practices as essential to femininity and consequently define femininity as sexual desirability and sexual availability to the male gaze. They also naturalize this particular mode of femininity so that taking up one's natural qualities as a woman has a particular sartorial form. And both, interestingly, posit wearing makeup and revealing clothes as acts of sexual liberation and sexual equality. Within this rhetoric of sexual availability as sexual normality, veiling comes to be seen as not just anti-secular, but as sexually abnormal and fundamentally sexually repressive. Indeed, Melian's and Amara's interventions highlight the way in which sex norms and secular norms have become coextensive. If secular integration into the Republic entails the inhabitation of secular sexuality, it is perhaps unsurprising that the autobiography, the most intimate of nonfiction genres, has emerged as a popular source of information about Muslim French women's lives. And this is true, obviously, not just in France, but in North America and Europe at large as well, right? These autobiographies by kind of secular Muslim women like Ayan Hirsi Ali, Nekla Kelek in Germany, Irshad Manji here in Canada. The most powerful of these autobiographies, at least in France, and I think probably generally, remains Samira Belle-Île's Dans l'enfer des tourmentes, In the Hell of Gang Rapes, in which Belle-Île narrates her journey from abuse at the hands of her father, to her trauma as the victim of multiple gang rapes in the housing projects, to her descent into alcohol and drug addiction, to her ultimate recovery, which includes learning how to have normal sexual and romantic relationships. Though Belle-Île clearly considered this a profoundly personal story and wrote it as part of her therapy, her therapist encouraged her to publish it, and it was marketed by her publishers as a window into the general sexual savagery of the banlieue. According to the publisher, the text, quote, unveils the sexual violence that has been institutionalized and made ordinary in the banlieue, unquote. The metaphor of unveiling used by Belle-Île's publisher is significant. For as much as Belle-Île pulls back the veil on life in the banlieue, she does so by offering up her troubled, familial, sexual, and romantic life for public perusal. The structure of that double unveiling underscores the way in which the narrative of secular Republican integration, in which normalized sexuality signifies successful integration, requires women like Belle-Île, Amara, and Melian to reveal publicly the most intimate details of their private lives in order to be recognized as integrated subjects. If normal sex is private sex, then these secular Muslim women must nonetheless prove their normality precisely by bringing their sex lives into the public sphere for monetized consumption by a literary public. If Belle-Île and others, by unveiling their private sexual lives, have been at least partially accepted as integrated subjects, other Muslim French women, and especially veiled women, have not, though they are no less incited to speak about their sexual beliefs and practices. Consider a January 2004 episode of 100 minutes, 100 minutes pour comprendre, 100 minutes to understand, entitled God and the Republic. Though most of the show concerned the then proposed law banning religious signs in public schools, it suddenly veered midpoint into a pre-recorded segment on virginity certificates. The segment began by observing that many immigrant Muslim families demand certificates of virginity for their potential daughters-in-law. It then featured a local association that organizes against virginity certificates and includes a number of veiled women. The reporter interviews one of these veiled women, who states that though it remains important not to have sex before marriage, no woman should have to show herself like that. While such an attitude seems perfectly logical within an ethic of bodily sovereignty, the reporter frames these veiled women's position against virginity certificates as a paradox, noting bemusedly that, I quote, even though they are against the certificate, they are for chastity in marriage, unquote, as if this is like some enormous paradox. The short segment ends tangentially with the reporter's statement that women of immigrant descent are twice as likely to suffer sexual aggression as French women, right? Because of course they can't be French. When the show came back to its debate format, the moderator immediately turned to Saïda Kada, a veiled Muslim French activist and one of a dozen or so guests, and asked, is what we heard true? Of course it is, Kada replied, but we're speaking about something, i.e. sexual aggression and virginity certificates, for which Islam and the veil are not responsible. Kada then asserted her own disapproval of virginity certificates. This moment, I think, is remarkable in exemplifying a common double move. Not only do secular Republicans explicitly associate the headscarf with abnormal sexual practices and sexual violence, but then they also demand that veiled women account for that association. Kada is put immediately on the spot, called on to prove her normality as well as her legitimacy as an interlocutor by condemning aberrant sex. Because she wears a headscarf and is immediately sexually suspect, Kada is compelled to reveal herself as sexually normal by stating her beliefs, her sexual beliefs in public. But precisely because she already wears a headscarf, because she is religiously suspect, she can in fact never be sexually normal within the terms of French secularity. Her viewpoint remains a paradox at best, fundamentalist double talk at worst. These overlapping acts of incitement, surveillance, and castigation occur in less mediatized settings as well. Karima, a longtime interlocutor, described to me the kind of deontic and discursive compulsions she experiences in her day-to-day life as a result of putting on the veil almost a decade ago. And I'm going to quote her at length here. "When you're a veiled Muslim woman," she began, "people want to know you intimately. Because the veil remains so maligned in France, you do everything to be accepted." Though she now feels less dependent on the acceptance of others for her own self-worth, she related how, in the first years of wearing the headscarf, she was constantly smiling and engaging others in order to prove that she was sans complexe, without hang-ups. They take away your speech in the media, you speak with abandon in private space to say, "Look, I'm normal. When I first wore the headscarf, I needed to speak to prove that I was normal." Karima's urge to speak echoes that experienced by Horia Demiati when the lawyer Varro demanded why she wears the headscarf. On the one hand, Demiati realized that her inner spirituality was her own private affair. On the other, she felt compelled to answer the question, to show that under the headscarf she was normal. If Demiati was compelled to speak publicly about religion and to reveal the inner workings of her spiritual and ethical life, Karima has had to talk about sex. She described working with another veiled friend at a small law office in Paris, and I quote her again. "Our boss, Anne, saw right away that we were veiled, and you know what? Right away the questions came. How do you live? What do you think about polygamy? Tell me about your sexuality, etc." Karima answered honestly that she was not against polygamy, explaining that she found the framework of polygamy less troubling than adultery. But she's aware that saying so has consequences. "I mean, I risk looking like a fundamentalist," she said. She also recognized the dynamic at work in these incitements to speak about sex. "You're being tested," she said. "You're often spoken to about homosexuality. You're spoken to with crude words about sex. You're being tested. You have to prove that you're normal." Unquote. She described another moment with Anne, who once said nonchalantly to Karima, who is her employee, recall, not her friend. Anne said nonchalantly to Karima that she would like to take a lover. Anne then asked Karima what she thought. Laughing incredulously at the memory, Karima continued, "What does she want me to say? It's haram, it's forbidden. What does she want me to say?" Having already revealed herself as a fundamentalist in their previous conversation about polygamy, Karima kept her mouth shut this time. Now, I'll return to Karima and to the bind in which she finds herself in the final part of my talk. Before I do so, however, I want to bring the two previous elements of the talk on the regulation of religion and the regulation of sex, to bring them together to think about these regulatory mechanisms not simply as parallel modalities of secular power, but as far more deeply imbricated. To do so, I want to return to ni pute ni soumise and to the series of juxtapositions that they allow us to better examine. As the organization's name suggests, the model of heterofemininity embraced by Ni Pute Ni Soumise is produced and reproduced through a sexual contrast between the sexually normal musulmane laïque and her two sexually abnormal counterparts, the veiled doormat, la soumise, and the whore, la pute. If la soumise represents repressed sexuality and a lack of femininity, la pute represents an excessive sexuality that breaches the bounds of proper femininity. Moreover, if the sexual abnormality of the unfashionable soumise emerges from her refusal to participate in consumerist femininity, the pute takes consumerism too far, commodifying her own body. Thus, the semantic juxtaposition enacted by Ni Pute Ni Soumise reiterates a broader regulatory regime evidenced by the various laws I mentioned earlier, criminalizing prostitution and veiling. In other words, Ni Pute Ni Soumise makes explicit a wider secular Republican logic. To be sexually normal and therefore fully secular is to be ni pute ni soumise. That ni neither nor logic of secular Republican sexuality repeats itself within the figure of la soumise or la musulmane voilée. Consider Maître Varro's declaration in the Demiati-Trouchelou hearing that, if you recall, the headscarf is not simply a religious sign. It is worn to hide the fact that one is a woman. Varro's is a fairly common understanding of the headscarf as hiding or dissimulating the fact of womanhood. In this view, women lose their feminine identity if their bodies cannot be seen. Joan Scott persuasively argues that within Republican ideology, feminine identity depends on male desire, and male desire depends on visual stimulation. Hence the common notion that veiled women, to use Lubna Melian's terms earlier, hide their femininity behind a veil, and in so doing, to use Varro's terms, they hide the fact that they are women. Sex and gender are collapsed in this interpretation of the veil as hiding the fact that one is a woman. The quality of being a woman depends on one's femininity, which in turn depends on one's normative heterosexuality. and that normative sexuality requires that a woman be uncovered, that she show off her femininity, that she reveal her sex. Yet, as Scott further observes in her analysis of Republican reactions to the headscarf, if there was something sexually amiss about girls in headscarves, it was as if both too little and too much was being revealed. Scott reads the too much, i.e. not merely the absence of sexuality, but its excessive presence, this too much as an uncomfortable reminder of French republicanism's inability to deal fully with the problem that sexual difference poses for the abstract universalism on which republicanism rests. I find Scott's reading convincing, but I nonetheless want to take the notion of too much in a somewhat different direction, one that goes to the ambivalence of secular Republican sexuality and to the resulting and contradictory demands on Muslim French women to exhibit and to hide simultaneously. On the one hand, mainstream Republican feminists now equate gender equality with sexual emancipation and the visibility of the female body. On the other, many of these feminists have long criticized sexual exhibitionism for reducing women to their sexed bodies. Gender equality seemingly depends on some kind of visibility, thus the consistent demand by public school teachers pre-2004 that veiled students apparently showing too little of themselves reveal their necks, earlobes, and hairlines as a compromise. And this was a constant refrain at the high school at which I worked, with teachers asking veiled students to kind of pull down their headscarf just a little to show a little hair or show a little ear. It was like very strange, but this was the compromise. But girls should not show too much of themselves either, as demonstrated by the 2003 Affaire du String, when some schools began sending home girls whose thong underwear was visible between their low-cut pants and cropped t-shirts. Pundits bemoaned the over-sexualization of young women and the way in which, as Socialist Party leader at the time, Ségolène Royal put it, and I quote her here, the string thong reduces young girls to a behind, unquote. This ambivalent relationship to the sexual visibility of the female body comes together in critiques of the veil. For as much as the veil is thought to hide the fact of one's sexed body, it is equally criticized, sometimes by the same detractors, for unnecessarily sexualizing the body and drawing attention to it. A number of critics contend, after all, that veiling contradictorily reveals what it is supposed to hide, namely the sexuality of a woman's body. According to one liberal political theorist, quote, it reveals by covering. The sexuality that must be veiled is performatively construed through the very act of veiling it, unquote. Intended to dissimulate, the veil ends up exposing, and in so doing, it over-sexualizes women, confirming the presence of an inegalitarian gender system based on sexual difference and sexual inequality. This is, of course, a fairly common liberal critique of the veil. Feminist scholar Bronwyn Winter repeats this contention, and I want to focus on Bronwyn Winter because I think she really nicely kind of elucidates one of the arguments that I'm trying to make. Feminist scholar Bronwyn Winter repeats this contention in her analysis of the hijab controversy in France, examining the close relationship between hair and sexuality across various patriarchal cultural formations. She compares veiled women to, and I quote, models, dancers, models, dancers, singers, strippers, escorts, hostesses, and street sex workers alike who display and toss with practiced nonchalance, often elaborately coiffed locks in a carefully coded performance of titillation. From this point of view, the hijab is a hypersexualizing marker par excellence, unquote. Turning to what she called the paradoxical nature of the French hijab, Winter approvingly cites Moroccan feminist Maria Barnini, interviewed for Libération. And now I quote Barnini. If one refers to the spirit of the Quran, the veil's objective is that women do not attract attention, are not stared at. Young French women who wear the veil are not, however, doing so to become invisible, but on the contrary, to become visible. The veil does not protect them, it exposes them. There is an odd mix of rebellion, religion, and Star Academy. And unquote. Star Academy is a reality show, a kind of combination of Big Brother and American Idol. Drawing on Barnini's assertion, which is a widely shared opinion among secular Republicans and liberals alike, Winter seeks to underscore the ostensibly contradictory nature of the headscarf. Though it attempts to hide the fact that one is a woman, it ends up revealing it in excess of the normal protocols of female sexuality. Interestingly, the veiled woman and the whore are once again juxtaposed here, though this time as analogous figures of hypersexualization. The musulmane voilée becomes et pute et soumise, both whore and doormat. Whether the veil reveals too much or too little, or both too little and too much, Winter's reference to strippers, sex workers, and veiled women invokes the ni-ni logic of secular Republican sexuality, in which women must reveal something of their sex bodies, but not too much. Getting that alignment right, revealing neither too much nor too little, being ni pute ni soumise, constitutes the basis of secular Republican sexual normativity. Barnini's earlier juxtaposition, the headscarf as an odd mix of religion and Star Academy, is also telling. The mix is odd because religion is supposed to be private, not performed in public. Within the conventional Protestant qua-secular definition of religion, religion concerns the transcendental or otherworldly and manifests in ascetic practices if it manifests at all. Within the secular definition of religion, a concern with adornment, and especially with adornment that signals feminine sexuality, is seen as incompatible with religiosity. The notion that religion does not mix with sexuality or femininity underpins the widespread sense among many Republicans and liberals that wearing a headscarf with makeup and fashionable clothes is somehow contradictory. The internationally renowned Egyptian feminist Nawal al-Saadawi exemplifies this reaction. Writing about young French women protesting the 2004 law banning religious signs, al-Saadawi dismissively notes that, quote, the young women wearing the veil were often clothed in tight-fitting jeans, their faces covered with layers of makeup, their lips painted bright red, the lashes around their eyes thickened black or blue with heavy mascara, unquote. We, the readers, are left to infer the supposed contradiction between true piety and this kind of feminine sexual adornment, one that signals the apparent inauthenticity of these women's religiosity. Similarly, Winter refers to what she calls the Star Academy syndrome to question the actual religiosity of veiled girls. The hybridized hijab has become truly hip, Winter writes. There's a definite, I'm quoting her here, there's a definite media marketable coolness about being a modern Muslim girl in trendy jeans and a hijab, unquote. Winter implies that Muslim girls take up the hijab not because they have any interest in becoming more pious, rather they just want to be cool. Winter's reading of these girls' unvoiced intentions relies on the juxtaposition of trendy jeans and the hijab, which in turn relies on the common assumption that religion, real religion, does not have any truck with any such markers of feminine sexuality. Winter's critique reveals how much the secular imperative to define proper religion and proper sexuality relies on and reproduces an oppositional relationship between sex and religion. Religion and sexuality are brought together in this logic to demarcate what is properly religious, that which is not sexual, and that which is properly sexual, that which is not religious. Moreover, this opposition between sex and religion continues to drive the old trope of Islam as far too concerned with sex to be a real religion. Recall Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses from 1989, for example, and its prophet as pervert narrative. Rushdie's Muhammad, called Mahound, is a sexually ravenous clown who authorizes polygamy, and I'm quoting here from the Satanic Verses. Mahound, quote, is a sexually ravenous clown who authorizes polygamy and this is a quote from the Satanic Verses, God's own permission to fuck as many women as he likes, unquote, while the Quran is essentially a rule book about sexual intercourse, according to Rushdie, or the joke, that's the joke. The essence of the joke here, and the accompanying frisson of mockery, arise from Rushdie's juxtaposition of sex and religion. Mahound, Muhammad, is a charlatan because he is so sexually debauched. Rushdie's novel thereby plays on the sense, essential to Christian and secular imaginaries from the Crusades onward, that Islam is not a real religion because it explicitly recognizes and regulates sexual activity. Thus, to return to my overarching point, secular governmentality does not simply entail the parallel regulation of sex and religion. Rather, secular religiosity and secular sexuality are constituted and normalized together. Now, I want to conclude briefly by elaborating on what I mean by the cunning of secular power, a cunning that I have demonstrated obliquely throughout the talk. Recall Karima's interactions with her boss when she is asked, incited to discourse, we might say, she's asked about adultery and polygamy. Her experiences illustrate not only the incitement to exhibit one's sexual and religious beliefs and practices that has become the hallmark of secularity, but also the cunning of that incitation. Karima is compelled to talk about sex in order to prove that she is normal. But when she does speak, making public what would otherwise have remained private, namely her views about polygamy and adultery, she reveals herself as existing outside the secular sexual norm. She fails the test. In fact, the test is set up to record women like Karima and Saida Kada as failures of integration, as sexually and religiously abnormal. After all, it is precisely because, as veiled women, they are always already suspected of being sexually and religiously abnormal that they must prove otherwise. Yet the fact that they wear the headscarf and therefore subscribe to a sexual ideology different from Republican sexuality, as well as to a set of authoritative norms different from secular religiosity, makes passing that test impossible. Consistently called upon to make public and speak publicly about that which normally remains private, namely their sexual and religious beliefs and practices, veiled French Muslim women cannot but disqualify themselves as not normal, not secular, not French. The cunning of secular power helps, then, to defer and displace the fundamental tensions of secularism that emerge from its contradictory imperatives to separate and to regulate, to privatize and to surveil. As I have argued, the public discourses and political practices that attempt to regulate sex and religion have as their effect the contravention of the public-private distinction that underpins normative sexuality and normative religiosity. Secular power constantly trespasses the very boundary it seeks to erect. The burden of that trespass, however, falls on Muslim French women, incited by secular authorities to reveal publicly the innermost details of their sexual and religious lives, and then taken to task for doing so, for exhibiting in public that which should be private. That double gesture constitutes what I'm calling the cunning of secular power. Moreover, while there is obviously a historical specificity to this process with regards to Muslims in France, the state's competing imperatives to render private and to surveil, and the contradictory incitements to hide and to reveal, have been central to the regulation of other non-normative religious and sexual communities as well, including queer and Jewish subjects. What I want to highlight in conclusion is how much the cunning of secular power serves to displace the burden of trespass onto the non-normative subjects of regulation, who become responsible for the tensions and contradictions of secular rule. Thus, in a masterful dissimulation of the nature of secular rule, it is Muslim French women here who are seen to undermine the boundary between public and private, not secular power itself. Thank you.
Please. So you can see what I mean by that mixing of the subtly theoretical and that sensitivity to lived realities of navigating these intersections. We have some time for questions, and I have a microphone, so I'm pleased to hand it over to whoever would like first to ask a question of Professor Fernando. Danny.
Thanks. That was very interesting. I will try to defend, or at least present, the view of the I suppose nowadays old-fashioned liberal. So there's several. I'm not. I mean, there was a lot in the talk, and I'm not sure where I stand on some things, but I will try. So first of all, I find it interesting that to a great extent the defense that veiled women give for wearing the veil is itself given in the liberal idiom of "this is my choice." Mm-hmm. And that's, so to a great extent it shows the extent to which they themselves are saying, and I remember I lived in the UK, and then at the time there was a politician, Jack Straw, who asked, when he was doing clinics to women in his constituency, mm-hmm. he asked them to, those who wear the full veil, the niqab, mm-hmm. he asked them to remove it, and he said most of them had no problem with that. And when it was revealed, there was an outcry in which, and I remember one saying, he should not have, how dare he? And how could he do such a thing? This is their choice. And I found it interesting that it was made in the language of mm-hmm. autonomy, which mm-hmm. is the hallmark of liberalism. So I think there's an interesting side to this that I don't know exactly what to make of it, but it shows that even Islam or religious people here kind of use the language of liberalism to endorse their argument. But then it leads me to the point that I said, well, the public-private distinction, as I think liberals understand it or should understand it, is not so much located geographically. The inside of the bedroom is private and outside on the street is public, although there is an aspect to this as well. And to a great extent, actually, we owe it to feminists to tell us that the right boundary between the public and the private should not be drawn in this way, but rather for the kind of, that it is more about argument or reasons. And so the liberal perspective would say you can do whatever you want. You can veil yourself or not veil yourself as a matter of personal choice, exactly as we said. But you cannot escape the fact that the veil is part, and you quoted liberals who express this view as is part of a larger system of institutional, of norms, and these norms cannot be ignored when we see the veil. So it's not just a matter of personal choice. And I think that's the worry that liberals have. And that's why they would try to say, we will support you. Well, I don't know how many French would say, but at least I would say, I will fully support you. If that's what you want to wear on the street, that's your choice, yes. But I cannot ignore the fact that the veil is part of a broader set of norms, and these are these are the norms that trouble me. And here, actually, I think again, I'm kind of following feminist thinking that try to say that all kinds of norms that were many times adopted by women as a matter of free choice were explained as something that was part of a broader and therefore problematic system. So I don't know if it...
Well, I think my response to that is absolutely, yes, it is part of it, often part of it, the larger system of norms. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that there is to take apart the notion that somehow the public sphere is free of precisely the same kind of sexual norms, right? We tend to think of the public sphere certainly as having liberal norms about reason, about public debate, about the limits of speech, things like that. But we don't often think, and this is where, I mean, for me, this is where the other side of feminist theory is important, that the public sphere itself, which is ostensibly neutral, in fact is not neutral, not because it's not simply a question of sort of culture, but that the public sphere itself, what is recognized as not as problematically sexually abnormal, hinges on the sexual normativity of a liberal public sphere, right? And so that, I mean, I have no problem with the argument that that Islamic veiling often takes part in a system of norms, in an authoritative system of norms. That is not, what I'm trying to get at is that, and this goes back to the first part of your question actually, what I'm trying to get at is the ability of the secular state to leave certain private citizens alone hinges on those private citizens behaving properly. And so the secular state, the line between public and private, I agree that it's not just a geographical line, but it does mean that in order to be left alone, whether it be in the bedroom or to think to practice the way you want, you have to be doing it properly. The moment, and this is something that queer theorists have talked about for a long time, that the queer subject cannot be private because he or she is not sexually normal and must be made normal in order to be a private citizen, in order to be left alone somehow. And I think it goes back, to your point about the issue of choice, yes, I do think that the headscarf is often defended as a choice. And I've actually, Ben knows, I've actually written about this. And I think it is, I don't think it's necessarily using the language of liberalism. I think I don't think it's a disingenuous argument. But I also think that there's a way in which the liberal understanding of choice precludes also understanding the headscarf as an obligation. And so there's a way in which autonomy, liberal autonomy, hinges on the absence of authority in order for autonomy to exist. And what a lot of veiled women will say is that it is both a choice and an obligation. The problem in a liberal public sphere is that both a choice and an obligation is unintelligible. It is either a choice or an obligation, and the moment that you mention the word obligation, most liberals will say, oh, then it must mean it's obligatory on everyone, which means that it's normative for everyone, which means that it's oppressive, which means et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So as long as it's my choice alone, that's fine. But so I think part of the overwhelming emphasis on choice is also the inability, the unintelligibility of the way in which choice and obligation actually come together to produce the veiled subject.
Thanks for a really interesting presentation. And thank you for telling what I think is a new chapter in a very old story of the interaction of the West and of Muslims. Of course, it isn't just in contemporary France with its absorption tensions that Westerners have been preoccupied with Muslim sexuality or fetishizing the Muslim female form. And I think it's pretty obvious from the story you tell that story, the earlier story, is really informing the present dynamic. And I don't think liberals are the only people worthy of some pushback. I mean, 20 years ago, feminists were opining that multiculturalism is bad for women. Right. You're telling a very different story of female empowerment through personal expressive act, and there's this sort of blending or appropriation of some modes of liberal normative argument in the sort of direction that you're coming from. But what about the sources of oppression that feminists have long been concerned with, namely patriarchy? I mean, you're turning your guns on the state, so to speak. And I'm wondering where the processes of male domination and of gendered power imbalances play into your calculation.
Well, I think, it's really complicated. Patriarchy, obviously, is just a really complex, right? And I think, what often the reaction to my work is that it's asymmetric, that my focus is on, my critique at least is sort of launched at the secular state, at secular public sphere, at liberalism, republicanism, secularism, and not so much at Islam or minorities or the other sites of oppression and patriarchy. And I think my response to that is multiple. One is that we exist in an asymmetric context, and there are hundreds. Just go to any bookstore, turn on the news. Who's not talking about Muslim patriarchy, right? And so there's, part of this is also a way for, I don't think that it's not, my argument is not that patriarchy doesn't exist in Muslim communities or in minority communities, that patriarchy is somehow the domain of the West. But I do think that it's important to critique dominant power structures. And for me, in this context, my asymmetric focus is the result of an asymmetric situation on the ground. I don't know if that was your question, but
Can I follow up? Sure, patriarchy in Muslim communities. What about patriarchy in French society? And given, in the Chambermaid episode in Strauss-Kahn, there was a lot of talk about the particularity of French culture and the uniqueness of male-female relations in France, the workplace culture that you've referred to, hypersexualization, flirtation, and seduction as cultural modes of being, as ways of demonstrating Frenchness.
Right. Well, that's what I was trying to get at here, is precisely the kind of the sexual bases of the normative subject that is sexed and gendered in very particular ways, that's why I was kind of trying to talk about, and Joan Scott's done a lot of work on this, but the way in which the normative feminine subject is dependent on the male gaze, right? And that's why there's this kind of neither nor situation where one must reveal something of one sex, but not too much, right? One must be both, ni pute ni soumise, right? So I think that is part of a larger critique of French patriarchy, if you want to use that term, yeah.
So we have a number of other comments. response, and I'm out of time, 10 minutes or so, but we'll keep our questions short. Cyrus, and then Christina and mine.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I do not want to hurt you, but that's my opinion. And you know, critic is critic, right? But it seems you and many professors and many godfather academics like Michel Foucault, and unfortunately also many feminists, you encourage the states, political authority, and the religious authorities come and to govern us, to regulate, to secularize, to criminalize our sexuality, right? So polygamy, what's good for me, what's good for that, what must be homosexual, what must be that stuff, you know? And honestly, it doesn't make sense. If you are free, thanks, I do not want the state. Even the state wants to regulate my suicide, it's not its rights, right? It's my own rights. It's the same for a woman. Why you want to always to ask, regularize or criminalize or abandon and, you know, look at the woman as she has right? So why you want to see?
But are you reading me as saying that I want to regulate women's sexuality?
Yes, and because all of this stuff finally is states. Finally, you speak about the states or imam or like that, church, or in this case in French government. So nothing about the people themselves.
Well, I mean, this is absolutely not a call for the regulation of women's sexuality. Just to be very clear, like what I'm trying to do is figure out what exactly is going on and critique precisely the way in which we are all regulated. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that this is also not some sort of call for, you know, this is not a call for anything. I think that's the other thing, right? It's not a political platform or something. I don't believe that we can exist without, I mean, we live in a secular modern society, and it's almost impossible that we won't be regulated in some way or produced in some way. And so this is simply a kind of, for me, both, I mean, it's politically and intellectually linked, right? Clearly. So I'm not advocating, you know, I'm not advocating anything other than.
Well, advocating was suggesting a state let us lead. That is suggesting if I do not recognize this thing by the state, I don't care. The state wants to recognize my sexuality or not. That's my opinion. So I do not need the states to recognize my sexuality or other sexuality. There is no discussion.
No, it's okay.
I'm delighted, by the way, to introduce to many of you for the first time. We'll see her again, but Christina Rodriguez, who is our Genève visiting scholar right now. But Christine.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for the really interesting talk. I wanted to return to this question of choice, and you probably get this a lot when you present this work. And in what you say, it seems like there are many justifications that you could find in the French media or among critics for the actual ban on the wearing of a headscarf. But one justification that I didn't hear, but that's based on my understanding and talking to members of the commission that originally recommended the ban in the public schools for
the
minors.
Stasi Commission.
Yeah, is that the reason they actually enacted the ban in the school context was because based on testimony, girls had told them repeatedly that they didn't want to wear the veil but would be subject to reprisal by their classmates or family members if they did not. And so the justification, at least at the surface level, had very little to do with regulating sexuality or anything along those lines, but instead creating a context for choice for girls who otherwise wouldn't have had a choice. And so outside of the context of the school, it's a different matter, but the state intervened to provide a setting where people who didn't otherwise have that capacity could exercise choice. And in order to do that, it had to be prohibited across the board so that there wouldn't be reprisals. So I'm wondering if that rings true to you, and then how that fits into the story of what's going on in the French state when they're trying to
Well, I think there
regulate.
are two levels to that story. One is the more abstract argument, the more abstract liberal argument that one has to prohibit in order to make freedom available for others, right? So your freedom ends where someone else's begins, in a sense, and that's a classic liberal argument. And it was something that was deployed in thinking about the 2004 ban. find the argument enormously disingenuous in this particular situation, partly because it doesn't make any logical sense. If there's so much pressure on girls to wear the headscarf, then why are they such a tiny minority in schools? I mean, just logically, it makes absolutely no sense. Empirically, having worked in a number of schools, having talked to teachers in a number of schools, is there some pressure? Sure. Is there just as much pressure not to veil? Yes. They're in France, for crying out. I mean, so this whole argument about pressure, abstractly, I think, makes sense. In the particular empirical context in which it was taking place, doesn't. And I think you have to think too about who was called to testify. The entire, and I say this both, I've worked for a long time on this. Who was called was a very particular and very political decision who was called to testify. A number of people were not called to testify. A number of experts, in fact, who work on Islam in France, who work on young Muslim women in France, were not called. One of the hundreds of sociologists who work on this question, one was called. And so there's also a way in which the whole notion of expertise has also changed. And this goes to the emergence of the autobiography, I think, very much, right? And the kind of notion that there are, who becomes a spokesperson for what. But I think the more interesting question even is the idea itself rather than its applicability in this situation. And my guess is that you probably talked to Patrick Wey and Rémi Schwartz and yeah. So, and this is Patrick's hobby horse, right? But I think the argument about, I think there's the more abstract argument about making space for choice is more interesting. But again, it's complicated because it depends on how one defines pressure. So does general societal pressure not to veil count as an impingement on choice? It supposedly doesn't. It's only very specific instances of pressure. So the whole notion of pressure, before we can even start thinking about even this abstract argument, I think, the way in which pressure itself is defined, social pressure, also just needs to be thought about.
Two things that I think came together for me in the end that I was noticing from your talk. The first thing is what's new about the regulation of intimacy. Mm-hmm. And I think part of what you were saying, which I found so fascinating, was the cunning of secularity, this idea of displacing the responsibility of regulation onto the individual. That was really interesting. If there's something else that you can say about the newness of this, I'd like to hear that. And then the second part, which I think goes back to this issue of choice, is that there's a way in which talking about religion, and I come from anthropology too, and I think about this a lot, talking about religion and talking about sexuality, which are these kinds of themes, in some way kind of further reifies them.
Right.
And I was thinking, as you were talking, misses something about an older classic idea about how the secular Republican state is pushing for actually rationality, like the rational human. And all of your examples, or the examples that I can remember, really illustrate that. This idea of be consistent. If you're going to wear makeup, then you shouldn't be doing, there's some sort of pushing that goes, I think, both for religion and for sexuality. That's sort of the same thing of be a kind of automaton of a human who always knows exactly what they're doing and exactly how to do it, and is kind of fits into legal frameworks for one thing, but also, various political things. Mm-hmm. So why is it religion and sexuality instead of just rationality, instead of a kind of cognitive, human, unemotional, this sort of thing?
I think I would say partly, the argument about be consistent is interesting because consistency doesn't take place in a vacuum. Right, so it's only when wearing makeup and being pious are not consistent that there's a demand to be consistent. If they were consistent within some sort of imagination, then it wouldn't be understood as inconsistency. So and I think it's that moment of what is considered inconsistent, what is considered not rational, that I'm interested in, because again, the very definition of rationality as consistency depends on a prior set of affective, I don't know what to call them, cultural, but some prior set of ways of being and thinking, that when you're not that, then there's a demand for rationality and consistency. Does that make sense? I mean, and I think it's that kind of subterranean set of linkages, this kind of complex that produces a notion of rationality that is not that, and yet depends on another configuration of that I'm interested in. The question about what's new, I mean, this is the $60,000 question, or whatever the pyramid thing. But yeah, I go back and forth, and it's something that, like I said, this is a new project, and it's something that I'm still trying to think through, because on the one hand, there's obviously something very particular about the massive focus on Islam. Right, that's new in a certain sense, even as much as it draws on a much older kind of Christian qua-secular way of thinking about Islam. There is something new about the notion of the Muslim threat, in the past decade, and especially in the past 30 years, and then especially after post 9/11. At the same time, this process of the incitement to make private and to surveil, to make private and to exhibit, to privatize and to surveil. And then the kind of the state coming down on those who exhibit that which should be private, obviously has been something that queer and non-normative sexual communities have experienced for a very long time, and other religious minorities as well. I mean, you see the same thing with the Reformation of Jewish communities in France, where Jews were supposed to keep their religion private, but not too private, because they were still threatening then. So they were supposed to be both identifiable as Jews, but not too identifiable as Jews, right? So it's a similar kind of move, and I'm still trying to figure out what is a structural pattern, and what is new about this? What is new about this particular historical moment? And it's a great question, and the answer is I haven't figured it out yet. But there's something both new and old here.
So a number of hands still up. Unfortunately, only time for one more question, but hopefully Professor Fernando will stay for a few minutes after,
sure.
And we'll have some conversation at that point. So the final question to Professor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for such a nuanced read of what is going on today. And I think I really enjoy the fact that you brought together the politics and the empirics at the same time, and also theory, of course. My questions go back to your Cunning, the secular Cunning, and it kind of reminds me a lot of Edward Said's work, about Orientalism. So, which is like the assumption there is that the Orientals have always been basically cunning, in the way they have. So I wanted to hear a bit more about that, and I think that's brilliant, actually, to put it in, connected with the secular, because I have been thinking a lot about that, how the post-colonials are always, sneaky and all this stuff, Anyway, so I thought that was a brilliant way of putting it together. But the second part, I was interested a lot when you were talking about knowledge production, since we're talking about Edward Said, and, kind of a memory moment for him as well. Is the question of how experts are being constituted through these moments, and I think you brought up the question of like only one sociologist, out of so many that are working in France, but it's not just French sociologists, it's also like, from other parts of the world, So how is sort of autobiography itself, that originally was constituted as a site of criticality, now being appropriated in such a way to really consolidate republicanism? So I wanted to hear a little bit more how you saw that working out.
Yeah, no,
in
it's
your
a great.
own
I mean, it's a
project?
great point. Both points are great. I hadn't actually thought about the Cunning Oriental, so now I will try to work that into the thing. No, my notion of cunning. I don't know if you know Elizabeth Pavanelli's work, The Cunning of Recognition, and so that's really, and she's drawing on Hegel's Cunning of Reason, right? So that was sort of the more, but I love the kind of turning around. So I'm going to run with that and pretend that I actually came up with it. The experts question is really, I mean, it's true. It's really there is something, a new way in which expertise is being constituted, and that's partly why I am really interested in the autobiography. And I think the autobiography is a site for all kinds of things. One is the constitution of a new kind of expertise that's based on personal experience, which of course can't be criticized. Right, so there's, I mean, am I really going to go after Samira Belil, who was tortured in the sub? I mean, there's a kind of impossibility of critique, right? Which again, I think the more interesting question is one you just posed, which is why the state now, what these autobiographies do for secular power in a sense, right? Because it's not the women themselves who decide whether the books are successful or not. So again, this is not a critique. I mean, the object of critique here, I don't think, should be necessarily only the women producing these kinds of autobiographies. There's something much broader going on. And I think also the autobiography is interesting, and this is another direction I'd like to go in, but as narratives, right? And there's an old history of that, but also there's an interesting way in which I think they are very much a narrative of conversion from barbarism to civilization, from sexual abnormality to sexual normality. There's a kind of trajectory. But that also means that and this is how conversion works, it can never entirely be successful. Because in order to tell the narrative, the other has to remain, I mean, commensurably different, but not fully taken up, fully converted. Right. So there's a way too in which even these secular Muslim women always remain. They're called secular Muslim women. They're not just secular women, right? They're not just women. Their difference has to remain even as they are portrayed and offered up as the ultimate symbols of the Republic.
Now, let me say before we say thank you to Mayanthi, in the spirit of. And now for something completely different, in March, Larry Sager will be giving our last talk in the series. Again, if anyone isn't getting emails directly and wants to sign up for the colloquium, just go to the website and there's a spot to sign up. But I hope you'll join me in the meantime.
And thank you so much. This was really generative for me too. So
please join me in thanking Professor Fernando for her participation. Look. It's even
nice. Can I have it?
Yes.
Oh, thank you.